When you think of the biggest, most successful tech companies in the world today, who comes to mind? I'll give you a hint. It's not Facebook because they're only number 6 on the list. Neither is it Tesla or Amazon, who are number 4 and 5. Maybe you're thinking Google, and if you are, you're close. Alphabet, the parent company of Google and YouTube, is number 2 on the list. So that only leaves one possibility for number 1, right? And yep, you've guessed it, it's Apple. And not only is Apple the biggest tech company in the world, it's the biggest company hands down. Its stock is now worth $3 trillion. Friends, Apple is king, and its brand is one of the most recognizable icons on the planet. Its products, especially the iPhone, they're everywhere. You know, it's estimated that there are over 1 billion iPhone users on the planet. And think about how influential Apple has been. They've revolutionized the music industry, telecommunications, gaming, and almost every other form of entertainment that requires a screen. Their products are both innovative and they're easy to use. In fact, my granddaughter was using an iPhone at 3 years old. And speaking of the iPhone, do you remember back in 2007 when Steve Jobs first announced this release? The tech industry started calling it the Jesus phone because this device had a cult-like following before it even came out. One tech magazine published an article with a header that read, "The Jesus phone is here, and your prayers have been answered." So thinking of that, let me ask you something. Do you think that Jesus would have been offended by the iPhone being referred to as the Jesus phone? Initially, I thought, yeah, probably so. But then I came across this verse that made me think that maybe not. I mean, Jesus used a lot of everyday circumstances to communicate eternal truths about himself and about his kingdom. In fact, I think if Jesus would have launched his church today instead of 2,000 years ago, maybe he would have said something like, "And I want my church to be global like Apple." Find that hard to believe? Stick with me. Let's see if I can change your mind. In Matthew 16, Jesus is having a conversation with his disciples, and he takes a poll concerning people's impression of his identity. Remember this conversation? He asks the disciples, "Hey, who do people say I am?" And they respond, "Some say that you're John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others say you're Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets risen from the dead." Then Jesus asks a follow-up question. He says, "Okay, that's cool, but who do you say I am?" And perhaps after a moment of hesitation, Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And Jesus replies to him in, to me, a comical way, "Peter, the only reason you gave the right answer is because my Father in heaven just whispered it into your ear." And then Jesus goes on to say something really weird, but we miss it because we speak English instead of Greek. Jesus says, "And on this foundation, on the foundation of what you just said, Peter, I will build my church." Now, the word church isn't weird to us because we've been using it for 2,000 years. But to the disciples, it sounded crazy, maybe even irreverent or disrespectful. You see, in the Greek, what Jesus said is this, "And on this rock, on this truth, I will build my ecclesia." And you want to know what was strange about that? This wasn't a religious word at all. Ecclesia was a secular term used by the Romans who occupied Israel during New Testament times. The word described an assembly of citizen volunteers authorized by Rome to address social, political, and civil concerns that arose within the city. This democratic system inspired by the Greeks was also used by the Romans in every city, state, and country they conquered. So did Jesus have political ambitions for the church? Of course not. He was simply using the term to reveal how his movement would operate and the impact that it would have around the world. If Jesus would have made a similar statement today, I believe he would have said, "Hey, do you see how pervasive Starbucks is? Do you see how integrated into everyday life Google has become? Do you see how global Apple is? Yeah, well, I want my church to impact the world like that." Something we might overlook about the moment when Jesus made reference to ecclesia is the fact that he said these words while visiting a city in northern Israel called Caesarea Philippi. Now, this was a Jewish city that had been rebuilt with Roman roads, buildings, bathhouses, and arenas. In a way, he was saying, "Hey, do you see how this foreign power has taken over our nation and made its presence known? Well, you ain't seen nothing yet. Wait until you see how my empire will take over the world." Impressive, right? Well, I think it was to us. I think it is to us, but I don't think it was to Jesus' disciples. It probably sounded like he was paying homage to the imperialist power ruling over them. It would be like if Jesus was describing his movement to a group of modern black people today, and he would say something like, "And on this rock I will build my plantation." We would be like, "I'm sorry, what?" That's probably how it went over for them. So why didn't Jesus use something a little bit more familiar that his disciples could have identified with? Why didn't he say, "And upon this rock I will build my temple," or my synagogue? Well, let me tell you why. Jesus was looking for a successful institution to draw a point of comparison to. And unfortunately, by the time that he had come to the world, the temple, the synagogue, and even the Jewish faith wasn't influential in the world. Despite being perfectly situated in the center of the Roman Empire, it was largely ignored, irrelevant, marginalized, and out of touch with the world, which is ironic because God had actually established Israel to have quite the opposite impact. Remember what Moses told Israel just before they entered into the promised land in Deuteronomy chapter 4? He says, "See, I have taught you decrees and laws as the Lord my God commanded me, so that you may follow them in the land you are entering to take possession of it. Observe them carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations, who will hear about all of these decrees and say, 'Surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people.' What other nation is so great as to have their gods near them, the way the Lord our God is near us when we pray to him?" You see, Israel had been created to be God's chosen people, his royal priesthood and holy nation. Through this one people, God had established a plan to redeem the world through them. But unfortunately, Israel failed to ever move beyond the buildings and the institutions and religious hierarchies in order to recognize why God had created them in the first place. So when God sends his son, Jesus, into the world, Jesus reboots the plan for the world's redemption. And he refers to the starting point of this new movement when he says, "And I will build my church." His word choice is signaling a paradigm shift where this movement would no longer operate in a single nation, among a single people, in a single place. In effect, Jesus was saying, "I am going to make my movement mobile, dynamic, and global, just like Apple." You see, in the same way that the Roman Empire made its authority and influence known in the far reaches of its empire, Jesus was declaring that his movement would make the power, presence, and culture of heaven known on earth. So here's a question for you. Was his movement successful? Did his ecclesia impact the world? And the obvious answer is yes. All you have to do is look at Acts to know that that's the case. Listen to beginning at verse 42 what it says. It says, "They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship and to breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. And the Lord added to their numbers daily those who were being saved." And you want to know the most impressive thing about this movement, friends? It's that what started in Jerusalem was so vibrant and expansive that ultimately it was the only power on earth strong enough to conquer the Roman Empire. With no support from the government, no New Testament Bible, no seminaries, professional ministers, no campuses, and none of the benefits of modern technology, Jesus' church turned the world upside down. And in case you're thinking that this is just ancient history, you should know that for the last 2,000 years, no institution in the world has done more for humanity than Jesus' church. Check this out.
What is church?
Is it a building?
With some pews
A piano?
and stained glass?
Or is it something more?
2,000 years ago, the church was born.
It wasn't made up of the famous, the rich, or the powerful.
It was made up of everyday people who passionately believed in the message of Jesus.
It was the beginning of a revolution of love and freedom that would change the world forever.
In 369 AD, the church built the first hospital
As a place to care for those who cannot care for themselves. Today, the church is the largest single provider of healthcare in history.
The church was the first to stand up for the rights of children, creating the first and largest orphanage system in the world.
100 out of the first 110 universities in America
were founded as Christian institutions.
Places like Harvard,
Dartmouth,
Yale,
And Princeton.
much of the world's greatest art
architecture,
Literature.
and music has been shaped by the church.
So that is what the church has done over the last 2,000 years. But what about the last 200 or the last 50? Let me ask you this. What has the church been about the last 20 to 25 years? Has the modern church continued to impact the world the way Jesus declared it would in Matthew 16:18? Are we still dynamic or have we grown static? Are we still mobile or have we become fixed in one place? Are we mission driven or have we become consumer driven? Are we growing or are we shrinking? Are we influential in the world or are we being ignored? I guess the question that I'm asking is, are we still a movement or have we become just another monument? You know, for many, the church has been reduced to a building where we meet once a week, to an activity that takes place for a couple of hours on the weekend, and to an experience that we share almost exclusively among ourselves. And when it's over, when we leave, we disconnect and go back to a completely different life. Do you want to know when I came face to face with this realization? It was back in March of 2020 when the doors of our church buildings were closed for like 3 months. Was it just me or did it feel like the movement of Christianity just stopped during that season? For most churches, when our building closed, our ministry stopped, our discipleship stopped, our service stopped, our evangelism stopped, our worship stopped. Friends, this year, 2022, is a reboot. We want to reclaim the calling of Matthew 16:18, and that's the reason behind our campaign this year. Hey, remember Peter, the disciple who prompted Jesus to declare, "And on this rock I'll build my church"? Well, later he would write these words, "For we are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession." Hopefully that sounds familiar. And he goes on to say, "That you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." Friends, this is who we truly are. And you know what? Though I think we've deviated a bit from Jesus' original call, I believe that the church is still the most important movement in the world. And I believe that we are in a season where believers are starting to recognize that we aren't an institution, we're revolution. And it's time for New Life to join that revolution. Let me show you a video of what that looks like.
Today, the church is stronger than ever,
and continues to impact every corner of the world.
Over 300,000 churches in America.
and almost 5 million churches around the world stand ready to be instruments of change, to do what governments could never do.
Every day, the church brings food and fresh water to millions of people across the world.
It has a renewed passion to help widows and orphans.
And fights to free slaves in every part of the world.
It stands ready as a first responder on the scene to provide relief for victims of disaster.
The ripple of Jesus' impact can be clearly seen and felt in the church today.
And it's made up of people like me and you.
Today, you didn't just come to a building.
You came to a revolution 2,000 years in the making.
The world is facing as much trouble as ever.
But we are not afraid. We were created for such a time as this.
We will continue to do what we've always done.
Proclaim the message of Jesus.
To help a world that needs him so desperately.
Welcome.
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 Welcome to church.